I'm Chantal Westerman with ConciergeQ Conversations. As you know, we like to think of them as sort of intimate little travel portraits where we talk to fascinating people all over the world about where they live, what they do, and what their passions are. And today I'm so blessed because I share a passion with the person we're talking to. Heather Rae first came to my attention some years ago when she was working at the Sundance Film Institute, where she headed up the American Indian Studies, which means she was really, for so many people, a beacon of light in terms of Native Americans becoming producers, directors, actors, screenwriters. She left Sundance after, I think she probably spent 6 years there. She left Sundance, went on to make many movies of her own. I'd need at least a half an hour to talk about all her movies here. But one of the ones that stands out in my mind is called Frozen River. And if you haven't seen Frozen River, go get it. It's one of the best movies you'll ever see. It garnered her so many, well, the film itself garnered so many awards. Among them, a wonderful actress, Melissa Leo, garnered her first Academy Award nomination for her performance in Frozen River. And if that's not enough, in 2008, Heather Rae won the very coveted Producers Award at the Independent Film Spirit Awards. Now, when I was at Good Morning America, I covered so many awards, but I loved covering the Independent Spirit Awards, the Independent Film Spirit Awards, because they were so much fun. So now I have a chance to talk to somebody who won Producer of the Year. Hello, Heather.
Hello.
When you listen to me
you.
say all of those things about you, and that's just this much of what you've done, what does that feel like? You're so young.
Well, I'm not that young. It's interesting because I was thinking about it's interesting to hear what you've done, because in many ways I feel like I'm just beginning.
Yeah.
I feel like for the years that I've spent working on independent films and having the privilege to be involved with a number of projects that I'm very proud of, I also feel like in some ways I'm just getting my stride. I'm just coming to a place where I really fundamentally understand story in a way that I don't know that I did when I was younger. I'm understanding artists in a way that's different than when I was younger, and so I feel like in a certain sense that I'm just really beginning, which is exciting to me.
You know, I'm looking at all of the screeners for this year's potential Academy Award nominations, and what fascinates me is that all the big studios send out, of course, their big, huge movies, but it's the independent films that I'm so attached to, that I love so much, that I always love visiting the independent film set. You are the independent film producer. I mean, that's what you do. It really becomes, I find, a tribe when you're working on an independent film. How does that inform your life as a person in terms of how you live and exist in the world?
Well, so much of making a movie, I mean, it's the one art form that you cannot do on an island. I mean, it's a collective art, as opposed to other mediums where you really could work as an individual. Film is a family, and it's a structure that, in many ways, moves at an unnatural pace. It's people trying to do more than they should be trying to do in not enough time.
Yeah.
And so much of what putting together an independent film, or a film for that matter, involves, so much of it is just managing people. And that's one of the things that I've experienced in the many directors that I've worked with and other producers, and include myself in that the people who I think do the best work are the ones that really understand how to manage people and do it with a kind of grace and just a genuine quality.
Yeah.
People who rule in those sort of old school ways of the director who's screaming and raising his fist. I mean, it just doesn't work that way anymore if it's going to work well.
People I've talked to who have worked with you, and I sound like I'm flattering you here, and I'm really not, because this is just a fact. It's just people I have talked to have said, I would do anything to work with Heather again.
That's so sweet.
She is a producer's actor. Where does that come from? So understanding the actors in your film, because I think a lot of producers, I'll get letters on this, but There are producers who don't understand actors, who don't know how to treat them, who don't know how to talk to them. Where did you get that?
Well, I did study acting when I was younger. In fact, growing up in the mountains of Idaho, I did community theater. In fact, I lived in some towns that were so small that I remember one year we put on a production of Our Town, and everybody in the town was in the play. And I don't even know if there was an audience. So I did find roots in the theater.
Yes.
And although I don't claim that as something that's part of my repertoire, or, you know, it's something that I have a reverence for and an understanding. And when I was in college, I studied with a gentleman named Fred Norman, who is one of the great dramaturgs of our time. And there's a number of you know, talent movie stars that we know that spent time studying with Fred Norman. And I had the great blessing of spending some time with him in those early years. And I went on from there to approach filmmaking as an art, although I have just as much focus and respect for the fact that it's also commerce. It is, for me, you know, in a philosophical sense, first and foremost an art form. In fact, really, it's as a foundation, it is the archaic form of storytelling.
Yes.
And I always take that approach. And I can't say that there's a film that I've worked on that I haven't felt proud of in terms of, you know, I haven't worked on something just as a job. I probably should do that at this point in time.
Yeah.
But until this, you know, until this point, I've worked on things that I felt as though we did, as a group, as a collective, uphold a commitment to story and to making sure that there was, you know, a kind of wholeness to this entity as a story in and of itself before we went on to shoot a frame of, you know, film. And I think that is something that that I share with actors who really are actors. You know, if we come to the table with the same intent, which is to tell a story and to have a kind of devotion to the story as its own entity, then I think that we're approaching things from a kind of common ground that we all have respect for what we're doing. But I have a lot of respect for actors because what they do is they're working, their beings and their bodies are the instrument.
You're right.
And there's a tremendous amount of you know, emotional and psychic wear and tear that they endure by using their bodies and their spirits that way. And I'll never forget a moment with Melissa Leo when we were making Frozen River, and I hope she's okay with me telling stories about her. I love her. But there was a moment when there was great intensity between her and the DP.
Yeah.
And it was an intense moment, and there was a discussion that we were out of the scene for a moment trying to figure something out, and Melissa was at high voltage. And at one moment, Melissa said to the DP, "Do you understand that I'm in the scene right now? I'm talking to you like this because I'm in the scene. I'm working," you know. Ooh. And it was for me, a kind of moment of, you know, if you can understand why someone would, you know, perceivably act crazy or whatever, the reality is everything that they are is the instrument at that moment. As opposed to, you know, me as a producer, you know, I push papers around and I move numbers around and I manage things, you know. It's different than your soul being bared in a certain sense. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect for actors, and always when working with them, and this is one of my secrets, so I'm exposing something to you, I take real time and care to make sure that they're protected in other ways. Yeah. Not just that they have, you know, what they need in terms of this being on set and what they need to get through their day and all of that, but I'm making sure that they're okay. You know, I'm praying for them. I'm surrounding them, you know, with a kind of protection that I'm recognizing the work that they're doing on other levels, and that's something that maybe not everyone would understand, but it makes sense to me. And I also feel like that sometimes when actors go to certain places, when they come back, there needs to be a recognition of that they need to come back and leave that where it was.
Well, I understand it. I love what you just said. I love so much what you just said, and I understand even more now why actors say, I'll do anything with Heather Rae. I'll do anything. You know, I was talking to Gene Hackman many, many years ago, and I said, how do you get so good? And he thought about it for a minute, and he squinted his eyes in only the way that Gene Hackman can, and he said, I work with better actors. They raise the bar for me. So it sounds to me like what you do as a producer, every time you make a movie, and why you're now understanding it, is you're raising the bar for yourself, for your actors, and I think that's also why you're able to say, I've never done a movie that I'm not proud of, because I have friends in this business who say, oh, I did that for the money, I hated the film, and I bet those words never come out of your mouth.
Not yet, but I'm not going to have the hubris to say that I'm not going to do that.
Well, and you're
because
honest too. Let's talk a little bit about a movie that you shot here in Idaho, as we sit here in the beautiful Sun Valley Lodge. Is this place not gorgeous, by the way?
It is. Yeah.
I mean, really.
It is.
Everybody come to the Sun Valley Lodge as we sit here talking. You'll love it. You made a movie in Idaho called Magic Valley. Tell me a little bit of the history of that movie and how you chose people like the incredible Scott Glenn to star in that movie. How'd you get him to star in it, by the way?
Magic Valley is a feature film that we shot in Buell, and the writer-director Jeff Zinn is actually, you know, a kid from Buell, Idaho, and grew up in that culture of trout farming, which is part of what the story is about.
Right.
Buell, Idaho, if people don't know, is the trout farming capital of the world.
It is indeed.
And it's a world that you haven't seen in a certain sense. And as a side note, I would say that one of the issues that I perceive in the independent film world right now is it's hard to make a movie about a world that you haven't seen. There's a lot of repetition in themes and, you know, and the kinds of worlds that people are exploring in independent film. There's a lot of sort of rehashing the same aesthetics. And I met Jeff because he's from Idaho, as I am, and I knew his work through his short films. He's a prolific shorts filmmaker. And when I first read his script, I felt like this is a world you haven't seen. And it's something that, you know, it's unusual in terms of the water politics around, you know, where does water go, whether, you know, there's a fish farmer that's needing the water for his ponds or an agricultural farmer that's needing water for his field. That's an interesting politic that isn't one that people really know much about. It's also a story that looks at kind of a day in the life in a small town in Idaho, which is a unique place. Idaho is a unique state. The culture here is different than even our neighbor western states.
Yeah, it's like nowhere I've ever lived.
Absolutely. And Jeff is an eccentric and a prolific visual artist, musician, writer, director. And his films, his short films in particular, gave me enough insight to know that he was going to make a movie that was going to be original, that he is an original voice. And that's hard to find at this day and age as well. He's also a filmmaker who, you know, in this kind of emerging generation of filmmakers who's studied. And that can be difficult to find American filmmakers who actually really studied in cinema. So many of them come to it by, you know, going to Sundance or, you know, being in the club scene. This is terrible to say, but you know,
but it's true.
And you know, frankly, they just want to blow up and you know and party and do whatever, you know, they perceive that the film world represents. It's sexy, in other words. And then there are filmmakers who, you know, really come from a kind of classic sense of understanding the form. And Jeff is one of those kinds of filmmakers. He still kind of has a comic book sensibility to him, but he's influenced by filmmakers like Lars von Trier and Kelly Reichardt and Bela Tarr, and I knew that he was going to make an interesting film, and he did. Yeah. And you know, it's a film that we had a great experience making, and the way in which we came to Scott is that, you know, Scott Glenn is one of those actors who is iconic in my. You know, he's one of the archetypes in terms of my coming into cinema and popular culture and all of that, you know, growing up. And, you know, I was heavily influenced by films like, you know, Urban Cowboy. And, you know, I remember seeing that performance and just kind of, it was, you know, there was something that was so mysterious about him. He affected me far more than...
He was incredible. I'll never forget his character name in that movie. He was Wes Hightower.
That's right.
Wes Hightower. It's stayed with me all these years. That's
Absolutely.
how iconic he is.
Yeah, which I always interpreted to be some kind of a tipping his hat to the fact that Scott is Comanche.
Yes.
But a handful of characters that represented, Native people on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like that was kind of a secret,
Mm-hmm.
because I knew that Scott was, had Native blood. So anyhow, when Jeff Zinn and I, the writer-director of Magic Valley, when we first sat down and started talking about the film, Scott Glenn was one of the first actors that we talked about in terms of, the casting of the movie.
Mm.
And it was someone that we felt very strongly that he should play the role of the sheriff of Gooding County. And so we made an offer and offered him the part. And I guess I can tell his story because he told it last night. But anyhow, he was at the time getting ready to shoot Zack Snyder's film for Warner Brothers, Sucker Punch.
That's right.
And so
Also shot here in Idaho, wasn't it? Where was Sucker Punch shot?
Sucker Punch was shot in Vancouver.
In Vancouver.
In Vancouver, BC. But anyhow, we got a very polite pass, and Scott gave me a call and said, I'm doing this other movie. It's a $100 million Warner Brothers movie, and it's not going to work, But I really do love this script, and this is, I would do it if I could. Mm. And so, we regrouped and made offers to a couple other actors that didn't necessarily make sense in the same way, but we couldn't get Scott out of our heads. And so, I'm good friends with the head of casting at Warner Brothers, Laura Kennedy, and just thought, I'm going to give her a ring and find out exactly what the schedule is for Sucker Punch. And
You're stalking his schedule. I love it.
But you know what? I mean, I think in a lot of ways that is what independent filmmakers do.
Of course it is.
They figure out how to get the job done, and you do what you have to do. And so, I found out that there was in fact a month's time, this window of time from between Scott's shooting schedule with Sucker Punch. And so I called him up directly and said, we can't get you out of our minds, in terms of playing this role. And he said, all right, let me think about this. And I got a call, the next day, and he said he would do it. And it was, I think, a great experience for him as well.
Oh, he loved it. He loved it. I know him well, and he said, I loved it. In fact, he said, when I asked him about you, he said, well, the best way I could describe her, Chantal, she's my sister.
Yeah, I feel that way also.
I'm always interested in a person's roots. I'd so like to know about your mother and your father.
So, my mom and dad met in Pocatello High School, Pocatello High in Pocatello, Idaho, in the early 60s. And I was born in 1966 in Venice, California, because they decided to go to Venice or to Los Angeles for a year. In the mid-60s when the Doors were playing on the Venice Pier, and it was a very interesting time. In fact, just recently, because I live in Los Angeles, I brought my dad down there, and we went to the apartments that we lived in Venice. And I didn't even know. I've walked by those places 100 times and had no idea that's where I lived when I was a baby. And we came back to Idaho when I was a year old, and I grew up in Idaho. And I grew up in an unusual sort of way. It was not necessarily, it was a complicated life, I'll say.
How so?
Well, it was a life that was...
Did you live in privilege, or?
I did not live in privilege. I grew up with privilege of spirit. I grew up with privilege of spirit, and I really mean that, because I was deeply influenced and affected by the people that I grew up with, this kind of wild culture in the mountains of Idaho. And my parents, although really modest in terms of our lifestyle and whatnot, my dad was a mule packer, and my mom did different kinds of things, but they were both worldly in terms of the way that they thought about the world. And the people that I grew up around were also really worldly in terms of how they saw the world. And in my younger years, growing up in Idaho City, it was a community of Vietnam vets and hippies and wild mountain lesbians and Mormons and townspeople, and it was a really interesting world to grow up in.
Yeah.
And as kids, we ran free. And I rode my horse every day. That's what I did.
Yeah.
And then late in my junior high and high school years, I grew up in Chalice, which is much more of a kind of ranching community.
And wild horse community.
And a wild horse community. In fact, I spent a lot of time, many of my days were spent riding my horse in the mountains, following those herds.
Following the Chalice
Keeping
herd.
a distance, because I had a mare.
Oh yeah. Good,
and I had to be
good for
careful. But those horses are part of my internal archetype in terms of understanding what it means to be a free spirit.
So, changing pace just a little bit here, we are creating the Sun Valley Film Festival, the very first ever Sun Valley Film Festival, of which you are
So exciting.
of which you are an enormous part. So I'll see you again in February, and I'll see you again in March, and I so look forward to it. What does a film festival like a Sun Valley Film Festival here in Idaho mean to you? First as a producer, but then as an Idaho girl.
Well, I can't tell you how thrilled I am that the community is going to, that there's going to be a Sun Valley Film Festival. It absolutely makes sense. And the reason why I think that regional film festivals are so important is because as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, you work diligently for sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes many more years to create this gift that you wait for the moment you're going to take this gift to the world. And the only way in which you can do that is to really engage with an audience.
Yes.
And the film festival, the film festival experience is the way in which we as filmmakers or storytellers in this day and age have the opportunity to really engage in audiences. If you make a movie that goes to theaters, which is a wonderful thing, it legitimizes the work in a different way, certainly in the industry and all of that, and hopefully makes money, and that's a good thing as well. But you don't necessarily have the experience of getting to go and sit with an audience in all of those theaters across America or throughout the world. But to have the experience of sitting with an audience and then having a conversation with that audience after you've screened your movie is a priceless and such a rewarding experience. So, I think that that's something that, from the filmmaker's standpoint, is the value in a regional film festival or film festivals. And for this film festival here in Sun Valley, I think it will be a great exchange between the community itself, who already has a legacy in the film tradition, and the folks that spend their time here, whether it be some of their time or all of their time, who are connected to the film industry and making movies and creating art and all of that. It just all kind of makes sense.
It does.
It really does.
And what I love about it is that Sun Valley itself, our little community, is so excited about it.
It's great.
I mean, for you to already know the seats are all filled.
Yeah.
I mean, the community of Sun Valley, which I now live in, I love it. In fact, I was thinking just a minute ago when you were talking, I, like you, lived in Los Angeles for years and years and years, and I never thought I would say the sentence, I know Buell well. I know that, and yet I do. So here I am. But people are so happy, and I think we'll bring people like you and I can bring people from Los Angeles and all around, but I think it'll be wonderfully successful, and in great part,
I think so too.
Due to you and your film.
I think it's wonderful that Magic Valley is going to have its local premiere, in the Sun Valley Film Festival. That really makes sense.
Yeah,
so.
It's going to be wonderful. Heather, thank you. You are a joy to talk to.
Likewise.
An absolute
Likewise.
joy, and I hope this is the first of many.
Me too. Thank you so much, Chantal. Thank you, everyone.
I'm Chantal Westerman, and this has been a great conversation with Heather Rae on ConciergeQ Conversations. We'll see you next time.